All right. Welcome everybody to another installment of Committee for Sydney Global. Today we are featuring Amy Liu, who is Vice President of the Brookings Institution and Director of the Metropolitan Policy Program. I am Gabriel Metcalf. I'm CEO of the committee. Let me begin by acknowledging that I am coming at you from Gadigal land. Amy, we always open every program with acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. Everybody in Australia does. It's quite wonderful. Could be a very, very helpful tradition for America to pick up from Australia. So by way of introduction, Amy is someone who I have known and followed closely for a long time. Brookings is well known to everybody, but in the field of urban and metropolitan studies, in the field of community economic development, in fields of transport, in all kinds of adjacent spaces. Brookings is the leading institution in the United States. Those of us who do our work at the local level, it's really the only national organization that we look to for learning about other places in a rigorous way. And when you're working at the local level, it's just so essential to be getting your ideas about what works and what doesn't work from other cities. So, of course, at the committee, we do that in all kinds of ways. I think that American cities are relevant for Australia, and it's not just me being a Californian saying that. It's because the metropolitan form of American cities and Australian cities is similar, because in both countries, most of the urbanization took place after World War II in the age of the automobile. And so, of course, there are so many institutional commonalities with the UK that structure the way things work in Australia in terms of how decisions get made and politics. But in terms of the urban and metropolitan form, the problems we face here in Sydney and in the other capital cities of Australia, it many times have a lot more in common with the US cities. So, so it's just one reason why things I worked on in California, so many of the problems translated very directly to Sydney. And so it's one reason why I'm paying attention to the conversation about how US cities are going to change coming out of COVID. And it's, of course, a conversation everybody all over the world is having. So I'm excited to hear, Amy, what you are thinking about all of that at this point. And of course, it is a fluid situation. We're all learning more every day, and no one knows how it's going to turn out. But you've been thinking about this as deeply as anyone. So over to you.
Great. Thank you, Gabriel. And it's wonderful to join all of you this morning. I certainly wish I was in Sydney to do this in person. Hopefully we'll get a chance to do that sometime in the future. You know, Gabriel was just a great colleague, one of those leaders in the United States that we really were thrilled to support and lift up his work and the work of his network. And Gabriel, just in preparing me for this conversation today, just reminding me also just the governance differences between the United States and Australia. And that's going to come up a little bit in our conversation right now. But there's no doubt what I would say to you is we've had a huge period of introspection in the United States, and particularly in our cities and what our cities stand for, what kind of opportunity, how we deal with climate change. And so I'm going to talk about that today, and especially now in the context of the new presidency. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start to show my screen. Great. And hopefully you all can see that okay.
Yep.
And what I was going to do is just really cover two things in my talk today. One, I want to just talk about the national moment confronting U.S. cities right now. It will not surprise anyone that the last U.S. president was antagonistic towards cities in both rhetoric and policy. So I just want to take a few moments to review the first 100 days of the Biden administration and its potential to fuel transformative urban solutions that may actually last for a couple decades to come. So I just want to say that because I don't want you all to rule out US cities quite yet. And then the second thing I want to do is just talk about the post-COVID city itself, what it will look like in an era of hybrid work. I think this is a conversation that's happening globally, and I just wanted to reveal some new migration data that we released recently off of government data that reinforces the importance of acting with an intentionality in terms of shaping the kind of post-COVID city we want to have versus just assuming an inevitability. So first, the big picture. In the US, there are 4 big structural trends that we are paying close attention to. And these 4 structural trends predated COVID-19 and have even further been revealed by the multiple crises in 2020. So first is that we now have a digital economy that continues to favor few people and places, in which just 5 metropolitan areas in the United States actually captured the vast majority, 90% of new innovation job growth in the past 12 years. And what we know is that the digital rich continue to prosper during the COVID-19 crisis. The proliferation of low-wage work. This is predominant in the United States, in which 44% of all workers in the US now in the services economy earn a median wage of just a little over $10 an hour in the United States, which is obviously too little to support their families and often in occupations which bore the brunt of job loss or virus risk during the pandemic. Systemic racism. This, we have been talking about this for our entire founding of our country, has obviously taken on much more of a conversation in the past year. And that what we know is now systemic racism continues to strip wealth and power from Black communities by as much as $156 billion in home values because of segregation and other policies. And this in turn leaves many residents in these communities with trauma from poverty, violence, and poor health outcomes. And clearly climate change, in which 42% of greenhouse gas emissions comes from the built environment in terms of transportation and residential commercial buildings in the United States, which contribute then to rising environmental risks worldwide. And our concern is that the uncertain post-pandemic future of hybrid work may threaten to fuel more suburban sprawl, more car trips, increasing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, these structural trends are not simply macro concerns. I do want to say they manifest in cities as a police shooting, as a business closure, as a tornado or flood that disproportionately impacts low-income communities. And so it's really important to think about how cities step up in this moment. What's interesting is to help, the Biden administration has proposed $6 trillion in investments to build back better in response specifically to these structural trends, with an American Rescue Plan, American Jobs Plan, American Family Plan, the first tranche of which, the $1.9 trillion, has already been approved by Congress. And I want to say what's interesting is that the rescue plan includes $350 billion in direct aid to states and local governments. So this translates, as you see on the map to the right, it translates to $4.3 billion to New York City, $1.9 billion for Chicago, $1.3 billion in Los Angeles. Imagine this kind of flexible revenue or revenue sharing for cities. At this moment, the local leaders are scrambling to determine how best to invest these unprecedented resources in ways that transcend status quo outcomes so their cities do emerge healthier, stronger, more equitable after COVID-19. And so in this, there's now talk about massive investments in affordable housing, neighborhood transformation, overdue broadband, water, sewer upgrades in disadvantaged communities. In addition, the jobs plan includes $2 trillion in massive investments in infrastructure, R&D, workforce training, the care economy. This graph here just kind of shows you the categories of the jobs plan that the Biden administration has proposed. It has explicit goals to use this investments to accelerate Biden's commitment to a clean economy and reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. Now, at this moment, there is a bipartisan compromise being talked about or worked through this week on infrastructure first as the portion that will move forward. And what you're going to see probably from the US press in the next couple, hopefully next week, is nearly $1 billion deal for roads, for transit investments, for EV technology. Again, an unprecedented level of investment in the US and in regional economies. And finally, Congress is swiftly moving on a parallel bill embraced by many Republicans to increase US competitiveness in science and technology. Now, in that bill is a policy idea that our team at Brookings actually recommended, which has now been turned into legislation, and which is we recommended that the federal government invest in a new series of tech hubs in the American heartland to expand US innovation capacity beyond the coasts and address what our European peers called the geography of discontent that led to the economic populism that across our two Atlantics in the last election. So now there's huge momentum for the US to invest $10 billion in 12 to 18 new innovation hubs. Think about this. This is about $500 million to $1 billion each in places like Detroit, Nashville, or Indianapolis to catapult their industries and their mid-tier markets into centers of innovation in the digital economy. So in short, what you see here is that in just 5 short months, the Biden administration and Congress are making unprecedented investments to rebuild better in the post-COVID era, creating some transformative opportunities for US cities. This is a photo of Brian Deese, by the way, not probably a familiar face, but he is the director of the White House Economic Council, and he recently told the New York Times that the Biden administration's top priority is to demonstrate that this kind of investment and this kind of governing works for the American people. And to do that, execution will matter, especially at the state and local level. So in other words, what we're going to need is strong intergovernmental coordination in the coming years. And you'll see that local vision and local effectiveness will actually matter in shaping how our nation emerges from the COVID-19 crisis. Now, what I think is going to happen is that this federal partnership with cities will accelerate what has been a growth in the number of inclusive economic growth strategies across the country, from Denver to Indianapolis, from Greater Washington, D.C. to the San Diego region. Business, civic, municipal leaders are all now striving to engage and increase the participation of more workers, more entrepreneurs, more neighborhoods in economic expansion. And that this I think is actually genuinely become the new economic competitive strategy in the United States, made more urgent by the COVID-19 recovery. And what I think we're going to see is that these federal investments now come at an opportune time when there's been momentum already building in US cities to move in this direction, to use these. So city leaders are now really eager, excited, organizing themselves to use this unprecedented set of federal resources over the last couple months to rebuild better, to make their cities more dynamic, more inclusive, more sustainable, and in fact, restore US global credibility and moral leadership on these topics. So it's an exciting time actually for US cities in the last couple months, and in just enormous urgency of action in this moment. There is one but, and that is there is still, amid all this newfound optimism, political divisions remain really deep. The 2020 election obviously ushered in a new president, but it also solidified Republican control of 30 states, as you see in the red map here. The result is, if you've been following the US press, is there's been a sweep of state legislation to restrict voting rights, limit local decision-making in such matters as transit spending or police reforms. And we're going to continue to closely monitor this and try to ensure that local state dynamics do not utterly undermine the transformative opportunities that we have before American cities. So the bottom line that I just want to share with you is an overview of the national picture, given the early months of the Biden administration, is that there is a critical window right now, perhaps a 2-year window, for transformative actions by cities through unprecedented partnership with the federal government to promote innovation, improve job quality pathways, fight inequality, and accelerate climate solutions. So I would just simply say, as Gabriel said earlier in this presentation or meeting today, is we ought to keep an eye on how U.S. city actions are going to shape out in the coming years. So there's that. I'm going to move now to talk about the future of cities themselves in an era of hybrid work. Now, there's been a lot of talk about the rise of remote work in COVID and accelerating the flight from big cities to smaller towns and exurban areas. Well, new analysis by my colleague, Bill Fry, who's the top demographer in the United States, what he found using new government released data is that some of this is true, but with a twist. And what I would say first is yes, if you take a look at the moves in this chart that last 2019, 2020, you see that there's a slight dip, which means that large metropolitan areas with populations over 1 million people did experience a net outmigration of people during the pandemic. But that dip, as you can see, was part of a longer term trend of more people moving out than moving in these communities in the past decade anyway. Meanwhile, smaller metros did experience a slight uptick in net domestic migration into their communities. Also, as you can see, part of a larger, longer term trend. One thing I will say, because I know this animates the discussion in Sydney in Australia, is that all US metropolitan areas actually grew more slowly in population over the past few years because of the drop in international migration to the US. In short, all US cities, no matter their size, suffered from population stagnation as a result of lower international migration. Now, the metros with the largest net losses in migration, or meaning more people moved out than in during the pandemic, are these 5 metropolitan areas: San Jose, New York, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, confirming probably what you've been reading in the press. Again, while all the attention has been on the pandemic hurting these superstar cities like these, the reality is that these trends are not new. In fact, San Francisco, San Jose, New York have actually been experiencing net outmigration for several years now. I think the data actually goes back 5 years. And it's likely due to challenges with housing affordability and quality of life, which all predated COVID-19. And Gabriel, I'm sure from your own personal experience, you can validate some of this. However, I think the more fundamental issue here is how COVID-19 will reshuffle population within our metropolitan areas. Because what we're seeing is not 100% remote work, but really hybrid work, which means that more employers are requiring people to come into the office a few days a week. And so what we're really concerned about is that we're going to see a shift, as you can see from the data, continued acceleration of moves into the suburbs, less demand for urban counties, at least by population, as people have more choices in the way they commute to their jobs. So rather than declare that cities are dead or assume that these trends are inevitable, I think what we've been arguing with a lot of our local leaders is that we ought to use the COVID-19 recovery window to proactively rebuild US cities and create the kind of communities and metropolitan areas we want, rather than just, again, as I said earlier, assume the inevitable. Now, last summer, we at Brookings offered this vision statement that local leaders can rebuild better by generating higher quality jobs and wealth creation opportunities, including quality placemaking that can advance racial inclusion and environmentally resilient economy. Now, to achieve this vision, in light of, again, some of the migration trends we've seen, there are 4 broader trends that I think we ought to keep in mind as we think about the opportunities and the market demand before us. First up, there is a deep demand for density in the knowledge economy, which for me means that cities, downtowns, and commercial corridors will continue to endure and thrive. Now, COVID-19 has accelerated the rise of the digital economy. That's not a surprise. As you know, businesses large and small all sped up their investments in touchless technologies, online platforms, virtual marketing, including the talent that is needed to fuel all these new technologies in this environment. Now, to date, the digital economy has favored few places with dense concentrations of talent, university R&D capabilities, quality places, other knowledge assets. We've already covered this ground. But what I want to just reinforce is I don't think this concentration or demand for these innovation hubs is really going to change much unless, again, we use seismic federal investments to push back against or help the next emerging set of cities really emerge from this trend. But overall, I think we're going to continue to see the knowledge economy continue to favor and reward the places that were already innovative. Now, economic concentration is also playing out within our metropolitan areas. Our placemaking scholars examine the extent to which the rise of knowledge-based jobs has resulted in demand for density or clustering at the neighborhood level, okay? Not across the entire geography or county, but at the neighborhood level inside metropolitan areas. And the answer is yes. In the last 10 years, across all counties, as you can see in that light blue line, what you see is there has been a steady rise of job growth occurring in dense locations. And the growth in job density in this digital age has benefited, yes, core urban counties the most, but what you see, as we saw with the other trend lines, suburbs, mature suburbs, emerging suburbs have actually seen gains in job density as well. And job density, obviously, as you know, is also good for the environment, creating more efficiency in our land and energy use while preserving open spaces and natural landscapes. Now, the benefits of economic concentration doesn't only matter to large metropolitan areas. Smaller communities also have to create some critical mass to keep up with larger cities. If you look at this chart between 2001 and 2012, I think what's so interesting here is that jobs in large, medium, and small metros, and even small micropolitan areas, they generally rose and fell together. But what's happened is since 2012, as the tech sector began to drive the US economy, the lines began to diverge. Large metros were pulling away from mid-sized and small metros, and all metros fared better than small towns and rural areas. And the micropolitan areas and rural areas that were adjacent or near urban centers did much better than the remote, isolated rural communities. And obviously, I just want to remind you, these are job growth trend lines, which are different from the migration trend lines you saw earlier. So if density matters, I think I want to bring up this next point, which is that proximity then is good for the office and commercial market. You know, the industries that are most likely to cluster at the neighborhood level in our analysis is what we found are mostly in fast-growing information sector professional services management jobs, which in turn attracts the clustering of retail and other local serving industries. So in other words, there is market demand for innovation districts, retail districts, food districts, art districts, where economic activities are clustered together in vibrant, walkable places. What's also notable is that the demand for office space per worker, at least in the United States, has been shrinking in recent years, a trend that will likely continue to accelerate as large tech companies and other employees shrink their office footprint in the post-COVID era or reimagine their spaces in preparation for a world of hybrid work or greater work from home. So for us, this creates an opportunity to redevelop an entire network of downtowns, main streets, neighborhood commercial corridors for the future of knowledge work and human collaboration. So when people are not working at home, they want to be in spaces where they can gather and collaborate. Furthermore, as more employers offer work from home options to their employees, local leaders should prepare to provide workers with options besides working in their homes to do their jobs. I do think that as vaccinations increase and public health risks become more manageable or decline, workers will enjoy the flexibility to work in all kinds of settings, whether it's coffee shops, libraries, public parks, rented flex space. In short, the future community ought to provide more attractive public and private gathering places with accessible transit and affordable homes that continue to leverage the benefits of density in the knowledge economy. Now, as we ponder the future of the built environment, I also want to remind everyone that not everyone in the economy has the luxury to work from home. So the future city, the future local community needs to accommodate all workers. Now, as this chart on the left shows, at least in the United States, the majority of the highest income workers, 62%, are able to work from home. But as you can see, everybody else, not so much. And on the right, what you see is that a high share of Black and Latino workers must report to a workplace to do their jobs, many of whom are essential workers employed in retail, logistics, and the care industry. And people of color are also less likely in the United States to own their own car, while or less likely to than white households, even though their car ownership rates have improved recently. So for us, in the long run, having employment centers connected by transit with multiple travel nodes and short commutes is not only good for the economy, but it's also good for equity. It's good for climate resilience. And finally, for the United States conversation, I want to acknowledge that Black communities have not benefited from the demand for density. You all know that small businesses really matter to employment centers. Small businesses make employment centers dynamic, hyper-local in character, and they're a source of wealth creation for a lot of local entrepreneurs. In the past year, due to consequences from the public health restrictions, in the United States, what we saw is about 1 in 4, 1 in 3 small businesses have closed in most metropolitan areas. And of these small businesses, it's often women-owned and minority-owned businesses that are least likely to survive, as at least that's what we learned from the Great Recession. And what that does is it impacts family wealth, it impacts key neighborhood commercial corridors. And to further accentuate the spatial dimension of this chart shows that more than half of the nation's small business recovery 5 years after the US Great Recession took place in prosperous zip codes. In fact, the least advantaged zip codes actually lost businesses after the recession, the last recession. And so what you see is that per the earlier charts, the demand for density, even by retailers, has not benefited all neighborhoods or submarkets in a community. And so on that point, I just want to show that if retailers demand density, at least in the United States, majority Black neighborhoods have historically have been overlooked by retailers. This bar is just a little bit complicated to read, so let me walk you through this. First, each bar represents the average number of retail establishments, 900, 800, 400, 405. These are the average number of retail establishments by neighborhood income level. The left set of bars represents neighborhoods in which there are very few Black residents. The right set of bars represents majority Black neighborhoods. And the primary finding from all of this is there's just a lot more retail establishments on the left than on the right, nearly double in number in some cases, no matter the income level of the neighborhoods. So the bottom line, at least in the United States, and something that we have to reckon with is that Black neighborhoods, even high income Black neighborhoods, are penalized for their Blackness. So let me just close with this, with where I began, which is we do believe we have an opportunity to rebuild better, where the rise of new technologies is not a source of inequality, but a platform for expanded opportunity for all workers and communities, including being able to achieve our goals for climate resilience. And I hope this presentation shows there's just market demand for this future vision, where a network of dense, vibrant job centers and opportunity-rich communities can benefit all communities. I'll just also close with what I started in the very beginning of the presentation, is that the new funding from the federal government is creating a really interesting opportunity right now for US cities to step up to this national moment, to rebuild their cities more prosperous, more just, and resilient. And I just think it's going to be an incredible 2 years to watch. Thanks.
Wow. Okay. Thank you, Amy. It is such an incredible time to be doing what you do, isn't it? With so much changing.
It's been a whirlwind. There's no doubt about that.
Okay. So lots to explore and talk about in this. Feel free, those of you online, to submit questions via the Q&A app, and I will sort through them. So Amy, let's talk about, let me just jump in first on addressing the geography of discontent. I think even the most fervent urbanists realize that if prosperity is not widely shared, you get bad things happening. You get Trump and Brexit and various other forms of I mean, what gets labeled populist backlash, but also can be interpreted as just a sort of cry of despair from people who have been left behind. I mean, that's a charitable way to interpret it, perhaps, but it's certainly part of what's going on.
Yep.
Economists have been focused on this for a long time. It's not like this is a new worry. You see some leading economists in the US be quite pessimistic about it. You see Paul Krugman writing that he talks about West Germany's investment in East Germany as one of the greatest case studies of smart policy and a scale of investment that has dwarfed all other attempts, and it failed to it failed to create dynamic local economies in East Germany. You see people like Enrico Moretti say that the forces of agglomeration have only strengthened over time and made it less likely to be able to turn around non-economically dynamic metros. So you see a lot of people who have studied this from the left, I would say, be quite pessimistic about the odds of doing it. Even they don't want to give up. They want to keep trying things. What have we learned at this point about what is likely to work?
Yeah. Well, Gabriel, I would just say that, you know, the status quo is not sustainable. And so we can do a lot of hand-wringing about what economic theory can tell us about agglomeration. And yet, as a policymaker, as someone who needs to get things done, as a community like you trying to think about these questions, we want to have some agency. And so I think there is a real reckoning, awareness right now that having tech concentrations and concentrated wealth in a very few parts of the country is actually making matters worse and pulling this country apart. And we need to do some massive geographic healing. I think there's a couple observations I would offer here. One is there is a group of economists now that realize that place-based policymaking matters. The Larry Summers of the world, the traditional neoclassical economists are now recognizing that place-based policies matter. And I do think the work by Raj Chetty has also put geography back into play in federal policymaking. And so geography of opportunity matters. And I think there's been a range of awareness that place matters. And macroeconomic solutions aren't gonna work. So I feel really encouraged by the fact that mainstream policymakers are recognizing the importance of place. Second is that when we put out that paper, Gabriel, about the need for new growth centers in the United States to push back against the geography of discontent, we were very aware of the literature on the power of agglomeration and the fact that, in fact, for all the great work that a lot of mid-size cities, middleweight cities in the United States have been doing to modernize their manufacturing, adopt new technologies, diversify their industry clusters, it is not enough on their own to push back against sort of the market trajectory being pulled into the coasts. And it is one of the reasons why we made an argument that it was time for this to be a national priority, that city leaders have been working on this, accelerating R&D, workforce training, doing it on their own. But the reality is Silicon Valley was created because of massive federal investments. And that if we believe the geography of discontent is a national issue of importance, then it requires national size investments. And we argued that in order to catapult these places with assets, right, that actually have innovation capabilities, but just need to be just bolstered, just, doubling their capability and their distinctiveness, that it needs about $1 billion of federal investments in science and technologies, in their tier 1 universities. And that's what we now have moving through the US Congress, is a recognition that this is a federal priority. And it's not only a federal priority, it's a bipartisan priority. And this is not going to be this doesn't solve for rural areas being left behind, because this is trying to basically say there's if there's an urban hierarchy, right, is that we need to help the next tier of cities bump up.
Yep.
And right. And
yeah,
while
it's a really different problem than rural areas.
Correct. So we're going to help this next tier of cities bump up to be a center of new technology and innovation in their industries. We can't, in the US, put all our eggs in 5 baskets. And then we do need to have a different set of investments and strategies for other places left behind. And so, those are the other conversations we're having. I would just say, Gabriel, the other thing based on the research we've done and what you saw in some of those trend lines is agglomeration effect still matters for rural areas. And, for us, we said, rural areas do better when they're close to an urban center. And it's not, we can't do the peanut butter effect. At some point, we can't invest in rural areas at the expense of urban, because what we actually need is to create these urban-rural synergies where rural areas can keep their ruralness and remoteness or privacy and openness, yet have access to the density of a nearby smaller city. And if we can accelerate that, I think we can actually help rural areas at least stabilize versus decline. So I think this is why density and agglomeration still matters even at different kinds of geographies or communities.
I mean, this moment we're in where this is going to be the first federal investment like that in a really long time, coupled with the changes in the post-COVID world, where some set of people now has a much longer tether about where they can choose to be and still have their high-paid jobs. Some set of people has that. I mean, if there's ever a time where these dynamics can be changed, it's right now.
Yep, that's exactly right.
Your map about the political divisions is very striking. People in Australia are following that. I would say this is a moment where people who care about international relations are really worried about US domestic politics. Partly because there's this question people all over the world ask is, when you sign a treaty, is it only good till you change which party is in the presidency? Is that the new America that your commitments only last for 4 to 8 years? And unfortunately, the answer is probably yes. But at the local level, do you see any differences in the way red states and blue states are handling this moment of the post-COVID city?
Well, Gabriel, I'm similarly concerned. I think everybody is very, as I said, feeling a sigh of relief about the fact that we have a governing administration right now that is serious about policy making, is serious about what an affirmative vision of the future. And there's a very small window to prove out to the American voter if this is the better path. I do think there is, the red map has been there for 10 years. So I want to also remind everyone that this is not new. And in fact, the Republican Party has held the state legislatures for 10 years now. And we have never seen the level of preemption and hostility as we have seen today, accelerated by, I think, the Trump years. And so it's not that they're red. because it was, was manageable before to have what I would call, split ideology or bipartisanship between local and state governing. It has gotten worse though, because of the national ideology that's happening. And I will tell you that there's a group of moderate governors that are really trying to hold the middle. We are finding what's really interesting in our cities. And you probably are seeing this in the news too, is the business community is stepping up in an unprecedented way in the United States. It's almost even though I would say CEOs and corporations are not playing politics, they are recognizing that values matters to their business bottom line, their commitment to climate, their commitment to democracy and voting rights. And so what's happening is business coalitions are partnering with cities to make sure that states don't like completely fall out of line. And state corporations have always had a huge influence among state legislatures. These states always want to be business friendly. And I think it's actually really important right now that the corporations are stepping up in new ways to kind of keep sort of pragmatism in our politics.
Amy, one of the big trends that's going to play out over the next coming years is corporations as employers are going to figure out how much they want people to come together and how much they're willing to allow people to work remotely. And it's going to be a grand experiment. Everything that can be tried will be tried. So we will learn a lot. And there will be big organizations that go fully remote, and there will be big organizations that go back to 5 days a week in the office and everything in between. I'm curious what your view is on sort of the distribution that is likely of those options, because whether work from home changes metropolitan form, and whether it changes patterns of economic distribution across the country, for sure, it depends on how long that tether gets for how many people. If you're coming into the office 3 days a week, you still need to live in the metro area.
Correct.
But if it gets less than that, and if it gets to be once a month, for sure, you might live anywhere. What do you think is likely to happen?
I am seeing, like, it's so interesting. There's a huge variety right now, right? We have a whole bunch of tech companies like Amazon, like Microsoft, that have announced keeping their offices and having in-office, attendance, and not going the remote option, because the importance of informal interactions and knowledge sharing among workers and culture. I mean, what you keep hearing from CEOs, it's really hard to retain culture and retain workers if they don't have a special attachment to their place of work. So I actually believe that we're going to see more of the 2 to 3 day hybrid work situation, which means the point that we were talking about earlier, which is that we're going to have distributed commercial nodes within our cities and metros, and cities and suburbs. And I think we have to now prepare for not having all of our office space in the traditional CBD. I think we're going to have multi-nodal centers. I think that in an era of flexible transit options and car trips and on-demand ride sharing, even for transit planners, they say it's a lot easier to think about fixed rail or fixed routes between clear nodes of economic activity, and then everything else may be filled by other kinds of transportation options. And so, in fact, we absolutely, this is the era and time to be very intentional about where those concentrated economic commercial activities are going to be in our large cities and metropolitan areas, so we can create some predictability about infrastructure. And especially in the United States, we're going to have, I hope, unprecedented level of investments in a whole variety of infrastructure in the United States. So, and I think I go back to the other issue is a lot of our workers don't show up in these offices, and there are a lot of people who don't. In fact, the majority of workers have to show up in their work every day because they work in a store or in a doctor's office or another kind of local serving job. And to not think about these kind of basic services and infrastructure investments or travel options and place-based investments for those workers, I think it'd be a shame to not include them as a major factor in this. And so in that case, nothing's changed. For 60, 70% of the population, it's the same. And yet we're having this huge conversation about the 25% or so that actually report to a job in an office. And so I really want to make sure we keep right-sizing the conversation to not build our cities for the global elite, and that we're really building a city that works for everybody, particularly those that actually have to report to work every day.
Yeah. I mean, one of the big problems for American cities is that public transport mode share has been really low outside of New York. And that all the other superstar cities, top out at 10 or 12% public transit to work mode share in the pre-COVID world. Sydney's got, I think, gotten a bit above 20%. So it's interesting. It would be double what the San Francisco Bay Area was, but not at all at New York or London levels.
Yep.
We're worried that people are going to there's going to be a cultural shift in the wrong direction. That the experience of being worried about COVID, I guess, in a crowded train or bus, will have dislodged people from their public transit riding habits, and that the attempt to make a multi-centered metropolitan geography of work might be undermined by that. I mean, what do you think? What's your prediction on how that's going to play out for U.S. cities?
I think that is a false fear, in the sense that we think that people are going to be afraid of transit, but they're certainly not afraid to crowd into a bar and a pub. And somehow, and you see the rush of people gathering together right now as restrictions are lifted. So I think that you hope that over time, that if there's a myth about transit, but somehow the myth of other gathering places aren't the same, that we kind of right-size that myth too, so that people ride transit again. Because what we know is the opposite is worse. If we go back to single occupancy vehicles in longer distances between home and work, it's going to just further undermine the sustainability of our cities. And so this goes back to, if there is a bias against transit, there is a public service or public policy action here to make sure that that doesn't become the norm. And so I think this goes back to why it's really important for intentionality about us as leaders really being very clear about what are the habits we want to create afterwards, and create the conditions and incentives for that.
Yeah.
And I would say in the US, the places that have actually put in the newest transit lines, whether it's Woodward Corridor in Detroit or the rapid transit line in Indy, have seen just record ridership in their short lines. And the younger generation of workers are owning cars less. And so I do think there might be a generational shift that would actually require and motivate our cities to build more of these transit options.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. Sydney's building a brand new driverless metro network, sort of a scale that no city in North America is able to do. And the question got asked a lot in the last year, does COVID change anything about this infrastructure? Should anybody hesitate to keep going? And so far the answer is no, full speed ahead. We're gonna need it. And it's going to support the future prosperity of Sydney. So it's been quite encouraging to see that. And just what planners know, if you have a good public transport system, people will use it.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Gabriel, this goes back to, it's really easy for us to be in the news cycle crisis and short-termism, when I think as planners and just sort of city advocates, we have to kind of constantly push for the longer-term vision. And we're going to get past this pandemic. We're going to end up with other crises. And the question is, again, what's the city we want coming out of the end of this in 10 years? And I don't want us to fall into traps of short-termism in this moment.
Yeah, well, I think your point you said in your remarks, there's nothing inevitable about the post-COVID city. We have a lot of agency in in what we make it. Changing gears a little bit, I want to talk about retail. There's been an interesting conversation during COVID about people working from home, so many residential shopping streets having, their best year ever because of a bigger daytime population. But there's also been, in almost every country, an acceleration of online purchasing and home delivery. The market share of that relative to brick and mortar increased everywhere. People who hadn't yet tried buying things that way tried it. What is your sense of the trajectory of that? I mean, how over-retailed are we as we look to the future? How much can experience sectors like bars and gyms and yoga studios kind of replace the functionality of what people are now buying online?
Yeah. There's no doubt that all segments of our real estate sectors are going through a disruption, whether it's housing, retail, office. And so let me just offer a couple things that we've been thinking about. We obviously think that retail we actually did a report called the Great Real Estate Reset. So if any of you all want to take a look at that, we think COVID should also just change the way the real estate sector imagines its products based on consumer trend lines that predated COVID. And one of them was the over-retailing of retail, and also that the retail establishments that performed better were the ones that were in walkable locations. So strip malls and car-dependent retail did less well than those that were in dense walkable locations. So, but the other is that food. I hate to say it, but like food has become the thing that people will spend money on outside of the home. And it is now the food budget for families has increased, going out to restaurants, buying fresh prepared foods, quick prepared foods. And so what we're seeing is the retail that performs well is when it mixes food with it, because it actually pulls people out of their spaces. And so the food buying habit has actually changed in the United States. Some of it you can obviously order in and everything like that, but in the end, most people's meals are outside of the home today. And I just think that's an interesting thing to think about as part of mixed retail products, we're seeing the shopping establishments that have a food cafe or food market next to it do really, really well. So that's something that we're considering. And I think this goes back to the issue of gathering spaces, which is people have been so locked in during COVID, is this the power of the third space. Home and work being the first two, but the third space has always been so powerful in our cities. And I think that's still going to be paramount, as how do we provide those third spaces, whether it's a restaurant or a park or other kind of gathering places. You can see that people broke COVID rules to find that third space. And so retail's got a role to play. And it goes back to, it's more about the quality of it, the mix of it, the accessibility of it. Because I think as human beings, we all crave that third space.
Yeah. Reminds me of visiting a friend from college in New York and kind of learning about the New York lifestyle of all meals out of the house for the first time, where she, what she used her oven for was to store her shoes. And you can, you know, it's a long-standing tradition of city dwellers is using the street as the extension of the home. And maybe parts of that culture are spreading. Amy, maybe just to give you a final question.
And I see a question in the chat too.
Yeah, so I'm adapting that question.
Yep.
Yeah, from Sarah Stace. How are you going to know if things are working? What are you going to look for in terms of the lifting up of this next tier of cities? Whether that's driven kind of organically by changing remote work and corporate hiring practices, or whether that's driven by policy, which includes both city policy, but also for the first time, a federal policy focused on spreading prosperity to more places. What are you going to look for over the next 5 years to see if that's in fact happening?
I have 3 minutes. I'm going to try to do this tightly. Gabriel, I want to know if people are better off. And I think that there have been a lot of traditional metrics about city dynamism that is around GDP, job growth, industry vitality, sector strength. And all of those things are important. But in an era of human-centered, human-powered technology, where knowledge is now at the center of our digital economy, and that it's people powering the economy. We are not, we've completely moved away from manufacturing as the core. We're a predominantly services economy globally, which means it's people delivering the service, it's people delivering the product, it's people delivering the technology. And so the question is, are people better off as a result of the economy we're creating, and because as a result of the cities we're creating, and as a result of the growth? And so to Sarah's question, what I measure, whether you're a large city or a small city, is whether or not income, not employment, whether the incomes of the people are improving. And some would argue wealth, because income is such a limited number, and we need to see intergenerational wealth transfer in their home equity and other indicators of wealth. Because we can have, in the United States, we always talk about top line growth indicators, and job creation masks a lot of low, at least in the United States, a lot of low paying jobs and insecure jobs and part-time jobs and contractor jobs. And so again, it's income.
Okay, I love the clarity of that. All right, Amy, thank you so much for taking time to record this conversation. Incredibly relevant for all the things we are thinking about here at the Committee for Sydney. And we are going to continue to follow the work of the Brookings Metropolitan Program really closely. And I think there's cause for optimism, and the story you're telling about the emerging next era of American cities, I think gives everybody a lot of cause for hope.
Well, I hope so, Gabriel. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation, and I hope that we can continue to have this dialogue between our two cities, our two nations.
Okay. All right, everybody. We'll see you at the next one. Have a good day.
Okay, thanks.